Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the unsolved mysteries of The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Some of these mysteries hide in plain sight. Others were buried on purpose by gods, kings, and tricksters who never wanted to be found. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. The King Who Rode with Monsters. Somewhere in Geralt's tangled past, before the story you play even begins, he made a bargain to save Yennefer's life and became, for a time, a rider of the Wild Hunt itself. It's one of the strangest revelations in the entire saga, dropped almost casually into conversation, and yet almost nobody in the game ever brings it up again. Not Yennefer, who owes her life to that very bargain. Not Geralt himself, who moves through the story as though the memory barely troubles him. Not even Ciri, who spends most of her own journey fleeing the very group her father figure once rode beside beneath a black winter sky. This detail surfaces through only a small handful of easy-to-miss optional conversations, tucked into dialogue trees that most players scroll past without a second thought on their way to the next quest marker, meaning the majority of people who finish the entire story never learn of it at all. What did he see out there crossing the spiral between worlds on horseback? What did he do in the name of that debt? And how did his service finally end? The game never says. It could imply that some experiences are simply too heavy to speak of, even for a Witcher trained to feel almost nothing at all, a silence that says more about the weight of the memory than any confession ever could. The Red Riders' true home. Long before they were feared as ghostly omens of war, the Wild Hunt were known as the Dirg Ruadri, elves of a shimmering world called Tir Nalia. When their original home was overtaken by the chaos of the conjunction of the spheres, this splinter group of Ensader elves crossed into an entirely new reality already inhabited by humans and unicorns. They were distinct even among their own kind, a faction of NL whose name translates loosely to Red Elves, a detail that hints at some deeper cultural or even physical distinction the game never bothers to unpack for curious players. What became of that first war, the one that apparently wiped out an entire human population on a world we as players never actually see, is left almost entirely to the imagination. One reading suggests the game simply doesn't have room for a second apocalypse running parallel to its own. And so, an entire vanished civilization becomes little more than a footnote in an elf's cold history lesson, spoken of the way one might mention weather from a season long past. Why Oberon let it happen? King Oberon Mursetach, ruler of the NL, is described by those who knew him as a distant and disinterested monarch, one who quietly allowed Eredin and Avalach to run the true business of his kingdom, while he withdrew further and further from his own throne. Why a king with such absolute power over his people would simply stop caring is never fully explained by the game. Some say grief hollowed him out after some private loss lost to history. Others suggest that immortality itself, stretched thin across centuries of ruling the same court, eventually breeds a particular kind of quiet despair that no crown can cure. The sort of exhaustion that comes not from any single tragedy, but from watching the same court intrigues repeat themselves century after century. Avalach, notably, remained one of the few advisors who stayed close to him even as his influence waned, which only deepens the mystery of exactly how much the old king still understood about what was happening around him in his own halls. Either way, His passivity created exactly the vacuum that let a far more ambitious general slowly seize the throne out from under him. The poison in the cup. Eredin's rise to kingship came through quiet murder, dosing Oberon with a fatal overdose of aphrodisiac amid the plot to force an heir from Ciri's bloodline. It's a chillingly practical death, dressed up as nothing more than an unfortunate accident of indulgence. The kind of quiet scandal a court might gossip about for a season before moving on entirely. What's left unclear is how easily it worked, and how little resistance Eredin faced afterward from a court that surely must have suspected foul play the moment their king was found. Perhaps the NL nobility feared him too deeply to speak against him. Perhaps, staring down the extinction of their entire world through the coming white frost, they simply no longer cared who sat upon a throne that might not exist for very much longer anyway. A court too exhausted by its own dying world to mourn one more dead king. The unicorns who sealed the gate. The wild hunt once travelled freely between countless worlds, using the Gate of Worlds, a terrible power drawn from unicorns forced into servitude against their will, after a long and bloody war against the NL. At some point in that long, dark history, the unicorns found a way to reclaim their stolen power and seal the gates shut behind them, forcing the once unstoppable hunt to rely instead on rare and difficult navigator mages for even the smallest crossing between worlds. The one unicorn players do eventually encounter directly, transformed and trapped in an entirely different shape by Avalaka's own magic, offers only the faintest glimpse of just how deeply this conflict must have scarred both sides of that ancient war. How exactly a hunted, subjugated species managed to outwit their captors so thoroughly and reclaim a magic so central to their oppressor's entire way of life is one of the more tantalizing loose threads in all of elven history. It could suggest the unicorns were never quite as powerless as their captors so comfortably assumed, and that somewhere in their quiet, patient nature lay a strength the ANL simply never bothered to measure until it was already too late to stop them. Carantha's silent breeding. Carantha Arafainel, the wild hunt's cold and calculating navigator, is said to be the product of a selective breeding program orchestrated by Avalak himself, carefully designed over generations to cultivate exactly the kind of magical talent needed to tear open portals between worlds. The game treats this unsettling detail almost in passing, a single quiet line buried in dialogue that raises far more questions than it ever bothers to answer, delivered with the same clinical detachment one might use to describe breeding hounds for the hunt, rather than shaping the fate of a living person. How many others were bred, tested, and quietly discarded before Carantha finally succeeded where they had failed? Was he even aware of his own strange origin? Or did he live his entire life believing his gift was simply a natural inheritance, rather than a careful, deliberate design, a lie of birth he may have carried without ever questioning it? The world behind the wraiths. For centuries, the common people of the continent believed the wild hunt to be literal ghosts. Wraiths astride six-legged horses galloping through winter skies on the eve of some coming war. A fear rooted in older northern folklore about spectral huntsmen riding through storm clouds long before the games ever existed. In truth, they were flesh and blood elves, capable of projecting themselves as terrifying spectres while only occasionally crossing over in a fully physical form. Why the illusion mattered so much to them, when their true purpose was slaving raids rather than simple haunting, is never directly addressed anywhere in the game's lore. It's possible the terror itself was every bit as much a weapon as their swords, softening resistance and breaking the will of entire villages before a single blade was ever drawn in anger since a population already convinced it's facing the supernatural rarely thinks to organize a proper defense. Ciri's vanishing act at the tower. When Ciri finally stops the white frost at the Tower of the Eagle, the entire game simply lets the falling snow stop, almost gently, without so much as a single line explaining what she actually did with her power in that moment. No explanation of the ritual, the sacrifice, or the mechanism behind it is given, despite the entire plot of the game resting on her unique ability to do exactly this one impossible thing. Different characters throughout the story offer their own competing theories along the way, some suggesting she must release her elder blood entirely, others believing the answer lies somewhere in the tower itself, yet none of these theories are ever confirmed once the moment finally arrives. Even the visual language of the scene resists explanation. Snow simply ceasing rather than melting. Light easing rather than breaking through, as though the game itself is choosing restraint over spectacle, at the one moment fans most expected a grand reveal. The most coherent reading is that CD Projekt Red intentionally left this vague, treating the white frost less as a puzzle with a clean solution and more as a fate to be endured and survived. Still, for a game built so carefully on payoffs and consequences, this might be its quietest, most deliberately unresolved one. The Elder Blood's true reach. Ciri's Elder Blood grants her the extraordinary ability to walk between worlds and slip through time itself. Yet the game never fully catalogues the actual limits of that staggering power. Could she theoretically visit any moment in history she chose? Any world at all, however distant or strange? Even the sorceresses who study her most closely. Women who have devoted entire careers to understanding magic most people never even glimpse, can only offer educated guesses rather than firm answers about what she's truly capable of. The narrative treats her ability as something closer to a storytelling device than a clearly defined magic system with rules and boundaries, which leaves fans free to imagine just how far her gift could truly stretch if she ever chose to explore it fully, free from the Wild Hunt's shadow forever at her heels, wandering wherever the spiral happened to take her next. Why the Hunt needed her so badly? The obvious answer is that Ciri's bloodline offers renewed access to the Gate of Worlds, long since sealed by the unicorns she never even meets. But the sheer scale of the Wild Hunt's obsession with her, tracking a single young woman across dimensions and decades, quietly raises the question of whether there was something even greater at stake than simple portal access. An entire military force, generals and navigators and armored riders alike, was thrown at the singular task of finding one girl, an investment of time, magic and manpower that seems almost disproportionate if a working gate were truly the only goal worth pursuing. This could imply that Elder Blood carries a kind of potential the NL themselves never fully understood or mapped. Something reaching beyond mere travel, perhaps tied directly to the desperate survival of their entire dying race against the encroaching white frost, a hope so total it justified chasing one girl across the width of creation itself. Avallac'h's divided heart. Throughout the saga, it remains genuinely unclear whether Avallac'h loves Ciri as something close to a daughter, sees her purely as an instrument of his own long game, or occupies some deeply uncomfortable space caught between the two extremes. He trains her patiently, protects her at real personal cost, manipulates her at every turn, and ultimately still hands her toward forces that mean her genuine harm. A contradiction the game never asks him to fully answer for. Even his own private moments of doubt, glimpsed only briefly in a few quiet conversations, never quite settle into a single clear motive players can point to with confidence. The most coherent reading may simply be that Avalok himself doesn't know the true answer. A being torn between centuries of cold, patient scheming and something that might, quietly and against his own nature, resemble real affection after all, the kind a creature so old might no longer recognize in himself, even as he feels it. Geralt's missing years with the hunt. Beyond that single startling revelation that Geralt once rode with the Wild Hunt, the game gives absolutely no timeline, no sense of duration, and no real texture to what those days, weeks, or possibly even months of service actually looked like from the inside. Did he ride out on raids beside them, sword drawn against strangers? Did he quietly resist from within, waiting for a chance to slip away? The gap sits there, wide open and unclaimed. An entire chapter of Geralt's life, the narrative simply chooses not to write down for us. A silence made only stranger by how openly the game discusses nearly every other corner of his long and complicated history. It's the kind of deliberate silence that invites 100 different fan theories around the campfire, none of which the game will ever fully confirm or deny. The merchant who wasn't. In the very first quiet tavern of White Orchard, long before the story truly begins, Geralt meets a quiet, unassuming man who introduces himself only as a former merchant of mirrors. Nothing about the brief, almost forgettable encounter suggests he is anything more than a bit of helpful local colour. A stranger with useful gossip about Yennefer's whereabouts, seated in the corner of a war-torn village tavern, like any other traveller waiting out the fighting. It isn't until much later, in an entirely different and unrelated expansion, that patient players finally realize they had been speaking all along to something far older, far stranger, and far more dangerous than any human merchant could ever hope to be. A quiet joke the game plays on its most attentive players across dozens of hours and an entire other story. The name that cannot be spoken. Professor Shakeslock, one of the very few scholars brave or foolish enough to seriously study this mysterious figure, refers to him only as evil incarnate, and warns that his true name has echoed through countless cultures across countless centuries, always wearing a slightly different mask. Some who study the old legends have quietly connected him to the German tale of a man who traded his heart for endless wealth, and to the older legend of a scholar who bargained his soul at a crossroads for forbidden knowledge, patterns that stretch back long before the continent's own history was ever written down. The professor's own notes describe him appearing under dozens of regional names across different kingdoms, each culture apparently convinced they alone had encountered something unique, when in truth they may have simply given new words to the same old patient hunger. Whether this means he is a single ancient entity wandering endlessly disguised, or something closer to a recurring idea given form wherever human desperation and greed collide, is left entirely open to interpretation, a riddle the professor himself never quite solves before his own story ends. The price of curiosity, Shakeslock's ultimate fate, and the elaborate magical protections he was forced to construct simply in order to speak safely about this figure at all, suggests that knowledge itself becomes dangerous the closer one gets to true understanding. The professor built an entire warded circle on his own floor just to hold a single conversation without risk, filling it with careful runes that took, by his own account, considerable time and expense to prepare correctly before he dared say the name aloud even once. And even then, his freedom to keep investigating further still came with a steep and lasting price. This could imply that this ancient trickster's power runs deepest exactly where curiosity threatens to expose him, punishing the search for truth long before it can ever become a real, lasting threat, as though the very act of naming him correctly might be dangerous enough on its own. 3 wishes, 1 trap. Every single wish granted through this figure's careful pacts seems to twist itself, almost gleefully, into tragedy somewhere down the line. Restored wealth arrives at the cost of a beloved brother's life. Endless immortality arrives paired instead with the slow, creeping death of every human emotion one might have hoped to enjoy for eternity. Even smaller favors granted along the way carry the same quiet catch: a debt collected later, a promise honored in the cruelest possible reading of its own wording. It's never quite explained whether this cruelty is intentional design on his part, or simply an unavoidable cost baked into the very act of tampering with fate itself. Either interpretation paints a portrait of a deal-maker who never technically lies to anyone, and yet somehow never once tells the whole truth either. The moon beneath the dust. In the climactic confrontation of that first fateful contract, our mysterious deal-maker calmly reveals that the dusty floor of an ancient cliff-top temple was, all along, a hidden mosaic depicting the very moon itself, fulfilling the letter of an old bargain in the cruelest, most patient way imaginable. Dust and centuries of neglect had hidden the image so completely that even the most careful traveler would have walked across it 100 times without ever suspecting what lay beneath their own boots. It raises a quiet, deeply unsettling question that lingers long after the credits roll. How long had that floor been waiting there, prepared for this exact, singular deception? Was the entire temple built around this one elaborate trick from the very beginning? Or did he simply recognize a perfect opportunity, centuries in the making, and quietly seize it the moment it finally arrived? The beggar of Beauclair. In the sunlit vineyards of Toussaint, a cursed noblewoman's slow transformation into a monstrous spotted white is heavily implied to be the work of that very same figure from the earlier expansion, marked by a familiar and ominous musical cue and a mysterious beggar who vanishes without ever leaving so much as a footprint behind. Servants who spoke with him beforehand recall nothing unusual, no warning sign, no lingering sense of dread, only an ordinary sounding stranger asking small favors that seemed harmless enough at the time. If true, it suggests his quiet influence stretches across the entire continent far more thoroughly than players might first assume, reshaping lives in sunny duchies just as easily as in war-torn kingdoms, always through that same patient, riddling, and merciless cruelty, indifferent to whether his next victim lives beneath grey northern skies or golden southern sun. A villain who never truly loses. Even when he is outsmarted at his own carefully constructed trial of wits, this ancient figure doesn't die, doesn't rage, and doesn't disappear from the world for good. He simply walks away, unhurried and entirely unbothered, as though losing one single game changes absolutely nothing about the thousands of other, quieter games still being played across the length and breadth of the continent at that very same moment. Contracts signed in taverns and back alleys players will never see or hear about. It's a deeply unsettling note to leave players on, gently implying that no victory ever won against him is truly final, only ever politely postponed until a more convenient hour of his own choosing. The debt never paid in full. Throughout his many dealings across the story, there's a repeated and quiet suggestion that anyone who ever asks too many questions about his true nature or digs too deep into the rules of his patient game ends up suffering for it one way or another, regardless of how the bargain itself ultimately resolves. This could imply that the true price of dealing with him was never really about souls or wishes or clever contracts at all, but rather about the simple, dangerous, all too human act of trying to truly know him, a curiosity that seems to invite its own quiet punishment no matter how carefully it's pursued. The two men, whoever won. It's mentioned almost in passing that only two people across the whole of recorded history have ever managed to best this ancient trickster fairly at his own carefully constructed contest. Geralt, should the player choose to intervene at the crucial moment, becomes one of those exceedingly rare too. The identity of the other remains entirely unrevealed, tucked away somewhere in the continent's forgotten past, a name that never surfaces in any book, rumour or scrap of dialogue across the entire game. Was it a legendary hero from ages long gone, or a forgotten Witcher predecessor whose name history simply failed to preserve? The game leaves this dangling deliberately, a hint of a much older and entirely untold story, running quietly parallel to the one we actually play. The Mother in the Bog. Deep within the fog and reeds of Crookback Bog lives an ancient spirit sealed beneath the roots of a massive, twisted tree, described in whispered local legend as the original Lady of the Wood, mother to the very three sisters who now rule the swamp so completely in her place. The game never confirms this outright, choosing instead to offer only careful pieces of the puzzle, and letting each player decide for themselves whether the entity beneath the whispering hillock truly is the ancient source of the crone's terrible, borrowed power, older even than the sisters who now speak in her name. Names no one remembers. Nobody in the game, human, elf, dwarf, or otherwise, seems to actually know the real names of the three infamous crones. Brewis, Weavis, and Wispes are simply the frightened, half-remembered names the villagers of Velen eventually settled on out of necessity. Descriptive titles born from what each sister does, rather than who she actually was before the swamp claimed her. This deliberate anonymity feels intentional, quietly suggesting these beings existed long before language itself had even settled into anything resembling the tongues spoken across the continent today, older by far than elves, dwarves, or any word ever carved into stone. What breed of monster? Even the game's own carefully maintained bestiary admits, almost sheepishly, that no one truly knows what precise kind of creature the crones actually are beneath their many disguises and shifting appearances. They aren't confidently listed among any familiar, well-documented category of witch, hag, or relict without real hesitation from the very scholars who compiled the book across many long years of careful, cautious study, hedging their own entry with more questions than answers. This vagueness might honestly be the most truthful answer the game ever gives about them, that some horrors simply resist being filed neatly away into any bestiary at all, no matter how thorough. The Sabbath's missing guests. Once every year, 3 young men and women from the surrounding villages and hamlets are personally invited up Bald Mountain to meet the crones face to face, only to be quietly killed and transformed into the very meal the sisters feast on together during their private celebration. The people of Velen know full well that this happens year after year. They send their own children down the trail of treats anyway, in quiet desperation, dressed in whatever scraps of costume the war-torn region can still spare. What kind of grinding poverty, fear, or generational resignation keeps an entire region so thoroughly complicit in this ritual is arguably a darker mystery than any single monster could ever pose on its own. The ears in the reeds. when the towering Wild Hunt General Imlerith visits the crones and asks them to listen carefully for any word of Ciri's whereabouts, the sisters respond by demanding a single human ear as tribute from anyone seeking their help, then planting those severed ears throughout the bog to serve as strange, living listening devices scattered among the reeds. Travellers who wander close enough might never notice the small, pale shapes half buried in the mud, mistaking them for nothing more than debris carried in on the tide. The full mechanics of how disembodied human ears actually manage to relay sound and information back to the sisters is never once explained by the game's careful lore, leaving the sheer method itself just as unsettling as the grim practice behind it. Gran's unfinished curse. Anna Strenger, known to the frightened orphans in her care simply as Gran, traded away her own unborn child for a desperate chance to finally escape her abusive husband, only to be punished further still and forced into years of unwilling servitude regardless of the original bargain struck. Depending entirely on the player's own choices, her ultimate fate can become a slow, cursed death that no doll, ritual, or clever trick can ever fully undo. Her body slowly succumbing to rot, even as her mind remains painfully, fully aware of what's happening to her. What isn't clear is whether the crones always intended to trap her this permanently from the very start, or whether her punishment escalated specifically because a stubborn witcher dared to interfere in their affairs. The godling with no voice. Johnny, the strange childlike creature who quietly leads Geralt deeper through the swamp toward the truth, is never fully or definitively explained by the game's lore. He isn't human, isn't quite a traditional monster either, and exists instead in a strange liminal space the game simply calls a godling, without offering much further detail beyond that single label. Folklore scattered across the wider continent barely acknowledges what godlings actually are, where they originally come from, or how many others like him might still be hiding out there, watching travellers from behind trees and half-sunken logs. Johnny's true nature remains one of Velen's smaller, but genuinely stranger, loose threads, the weavers who escaped. Of the 3 feared sisters, only 2 are ever actually killed during the final brutal confrontation atop Bald Mountain. Weavis alone manages to flee in the sudden form of a raven, taking with her a small but deeply meaningful piece of Ciri's own inheritance, and the game never definitively closes the door on her story afterward. Depending on which ending is ultimately achieved, this particular loose thread simply hangs there, unresolved, a black shape disappearing into a grey sky with no promise of ever returning or staying gone for good. It's possible the developers always intended for at least one crone to survive, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that evil, this ancient, rarely, if ever, dies all at once. The woven cloth that remembers. Weavis weaves her strange, beautiful hangings directly from the hair of children given up in tribute over the years, and these woven images somehow serve as a genuine, functioning channel of communication between the sisters and the desperate people who worship them from a careful distance. Villagers bring locks of hair the way others might bring coin or grain, a currency of memory and grief traded for whatever protection the sisters still deign to offer them. How exactly ordinary human hair becomes a working magical relay capable of carrying whispered messages back and forth is left entirely unexplained. Just one of many small supernatural mechanics the game quietly asks its players to simply accept, rather than fully understand. A bargain struck in silence. The entire relationship between the crones and the people of Velen appears to operate on a set of unspoken rules, that nobody within the game ever states outright, not even once, in any book or conversation. The villagers simply seem to know instinctively what tribute is expected, what price is owed, and what terrible consequences follow if that price ever goes unpaid. This unspoken, generational social contract, passed quietly down without a single surviving written record we ever actually see, suggests a shared history far longer and far darker than the game ever has time to fully explore. The city that burns its own. Novigrad prides itself openly as a free city, a proud haven for artists, merchants, and thinkers of every kind, and yet it burns witches, mages, and non-humans alike in its own central square with disturbing regularity. How exactly a city built so publicly on commerce and tolerance curdled so completely into organized religious violence is a mystery the game largely treats as grim background atmosphere rather than a puzzle demanding a clean answer, though it does quietly say a great deal about how quickly fear, once given a pulpit, can be organized into official policy. The king who changed overnight. King Radovid was once a reasonable, even genuinely helpful ally to Geralt during the events of earlier chapters in the wider saga, willing to lend aid and counsel when it mattered most. Yet, by the time of Wild Hunt, he is transformed into a paranoid tyrant utterly obsessed with purging every trace of magic from his own kingdom. Chess metaphors and cold calculation replacing whatever warmth once colored his rule. The game gestures toward personal betrayal at the hands of a sorceress he once trusted, and old trauma from the endless wars consuming the North as likely causes, but it never quite commits to a single, clear explanation for the change. This could suggest that raw power, once handed to an already fragile mind under the weight of constant war, doesn't actually need much of a push at all before it curdles quietly into cruelty. The bard who should be dead. After Geralt violently breaks his old friend Dandelion free from a very public execution, killing witch hunters and guards alike in the desperate process, the bard doesn't flee the city he narrowly escaped with his life. He opens a cabaret instead, under his own well-known name, in the very same city that had just tried quite publicly to burn him alive for his crimes. No one in the entire story ever comes looking for him again afterward, and the game offers no in-universe acknowledgement that this should be practically impossible. It remains one of the most beloved, most openly acknowledged plot holes in the entire game, one that fans still joke about warmly to this day. The mutant who walks free. Novigrad's zealous witch hunters actively persecute anyone even suspected of practicing magic within the city walls, and yet Geralt himself, a mutant plainly capable of casting signs and brewing potent potions in plain sight, wanders the streets freely without ever once facing any serious scrutiny from the very people meant to hunt his kind. Some fans suggest witches are simply considered too dangerous and too useful to provoke directly. Others quietly note that this convenient exemption, however narratively useful, never actually receives a proper in-game explanation at all. The sorceress everyone forgets to hate. Philippa Eilhart orchestrated a sweeping conspiracy in the previous chapter of the saga that led directly to thousands of deaths and very nearly cost Geralt his own life in the process. Yet when Triss learns that Geralt is now helping hunt Philippa down during the events of Wild Hunt, she reacts instead with visible, audible concern for her old rival's safety and well-being. The game never quite reconciles this sudden, quiet shift in loyalty, leaving careful players to wonder just how much history between these two powerful sorceresses simply never made it onto the page. The preacher's poisoned words. Throughout the crowded streets of Novigrad, various street preachers spew open hatred against non-humans and mutants alike. all with the tacit, unspoken support of the powerful Church of the Eternal Fire, and the game allows curious players to confront a handful of them directly if they choose. What's left largely unexamined is exactly how deliberately this dangerous rhetoric was cultivated by the Church itself as a useful tool of social control, versus how much of it simply grew organically from an already frightened, war-weary population, desperately searching for someone convenient to blame. The killer who quoted scripture. During a careful investigation into a string of ritualistic murders scattered across Novigrad, Geralt slowly discovers that every single victim had, in some quiet way, offended the strict teachings of the Eternal Fire shortly before they died. The killer, once finally confronted in his hidden warehouse, calmly frames his violence as an act of righteous cleansing rather than simple murder. The unsettling implication left hanging is that the Church's own teachings didn't merely tolerate this brand of extremism, they may have actively produced it, whether the institution itself ever intended that outcome or not. The vampire who guards the peace. One of the very killers Geralt hunts down during this same grim investigation turns out to be a lesser vampire, hiding in plain sight within a deeply devout, monster-fearing city that prides itself on rooting out anything unnatural. How exactly this particular creature managed to avoid detection for as long as it clearly did, in a place so eager to burn anything different at the first opportunity, is left entirely to speculation, though it does suggest Novigrad's famous zealotry is far better suited to persecuting the visible than the truly carefully hidden. The ashes of evidence. Early in his travels through war-torn Velen, Geralt takes on what seems like a simple job, burning the bodies left scattered across recent battlefields, only to discover the local priest has quietly been using the grim task to dispose of evidence tied to an illegal drug trade running right beneath his own congregation's noses. It's a relatively small mystery in the grand scheme of the wider story, but it hints at something larger and more cynical still. That even the Church's most devoted local representatives are perfectly willing to bend their own faith into convenient cover for private corruption. The knights who turned to crime, the Order of the Flaming Rose, once a proud and celebrated knightly order fully devoted to the ideals of the Eternal Fire, loses nearly all of its power and prestige under Radovid's sweeping reforms, and some of its former knights turn instead to running a drug trade simply to survive the sudden fall from grace. The game treats this quiet detail as almost a passing footnote, and yet it says something genuinely cynical and quiet about the fragility of any ideology once the funding, purpose, and prestige behind it suddenly disappears overnight. Triss's House of Curses. Wandering carefully past Triss Merigold's now abandoned home in Novigrad, sharp-eyed players will notice the outer walls are covered in scrawled curses and crude insults left behind by ordinary citizens who despise her simply for being a sorceress. It's a small, easily missed environmental detail, tucked away for only the most attentive travelers to find, but it paints a quiet portrait of grassroots hatred that clearly exists independently of any official church decree, suggesting the underlying prejudice here runs far deeper than institutional policy could ever fully explain on its own. The Hierarch's true power. Hierarch Hemmelfart, the supreme religious leader of the Eternal Fire, is mocked, mentioned, and referenced constantly by nearly everyone throughout Novigrad. And yet Geralt never once actually meets the man directly over the entire course of the game's story. For a figure whose personal teachings so directly shape the fate of the city's mages and non-humans, his complete physical absence from the unfolding plot feels like a curious, deliberate choice, leaving his true influence and personality permanently just out of the player's reach. The First Believers. According to scattered lore found well outside the boundaries of the main game itself, the Church of the Eternal Fire's true origins trace all the way back to the earliest human colonists who first arrived upon the continent centuries ago, though the game itself never actually dramatizes this founding moment directly for players to witness. We're left instead to simply imagine how a young, humble immigrant faith slowly grew, generation after generation, into an institution powerful enough to command armies and dictate the fate of entire cities. The vampire's one true weakness. Throughout the events of Blood and Wine, it's repeatedly and clearly stated that a higher vampire can only ever be permanently killed by another higher vampire, a firm rule that should logically make Geralt's many earlier vampire hunting contracts across the base game functionally impossible from the very start. Yet he succeeds regardless, again and again, without the story ever once pausing to explain away the obvious contradiction. It could suggest that Witcher mutations quietly create some unspoken exception to the usual rigid rules of vampiric immortality that even the vampires themselves don't fully understand. The beast who loved too much. Detlaf van der Eretain, the primary antagonist haunting Blood and Wine, is a higher vampire whose entire tragic arc is driven far more by grief and devotion than by any simple bloodlust. The game paints him almost sympathetically as the story unfolds, and yet the true depth of his complicated relationship with Sienna, the woman at the very center of his slow-burning rage, is left frustratingly incomplete, told to players mostly through her own biased and thoroughly unreliable recollection of events. The woman who broke him. Sienna, sister to the reigning Duchess of Toussaint, manipulates Detlaf's genuine affections for her own carefully hidden ends, and the game leaves plenty of quiet room to question just how much of what she eventually tells Geralt about their shared history is even remotely true. Her own account paints herself as more victim than villain throughout, yet the long trail of destruction that follows wherever she goes suggests a far more complicated and possibly far darker version of events than she seems willing to openly admit. The curse that needed no witch. Marlene, a noblewoman discovered transformed into a monstrous spotted white within the events of Blood and Wine, was cursed by a mysterious beggar who vanishes just as suddenly as he first appears, accompanied by a very familiar and deeply ominous musical theme that long-time players will instantly recognize. The game strongly hints, without ever quite outright confirming it, that this is the very same ancient trickster from Hearts of Stone, quietly extending his considerable reach into a sun-soaked duchy that otherwise seems almost entirely untouched by his usual patient games. The Vampire Council's silence. Higher vampires like the beloved Regis strongly suggest a broader, hidden society of their own kind exists somewhere out there, one with its own private rules, careful hierarchies, and long history stretching back many centuries before Geralt's own story ever begins. Unlike their more animalistic cousins, higher vampires are said to walk among ordinary people almost undetected, living out quietly convincing human lives in cities across the continent, indistinguishable even to a witcher's medallion, until the moment they choose to reveal themselves. Yet the game only ever shows curious players small, scattered fragments of this hidden world, a handful of individuals scattered thinly across the wider story. What the full scope of higher vampire civilization actually looks like, hidden somewhere just beyond the edges of the map, remains one of the most tantalizing unexplored corners of the entire setting. Regis's centuries of silence. Emil Regis, easily one of the most beloved and gentle characters in the entire saga, spends literal centuries living quietly among ordinary humans, deliberately abstaining from blood entirely for reasons all his own, long before Geralt ever crosses paths with him. What exactly drove him towards such a radical, lifelong decision, and what specific event or private realization first pushed a being of his considerable power toward that kind of unwavering self-control, is only ever hinted at through small, careful fragments of conversation, rather than fully and openly explained. The Bruxa's missing years. Bruxa, the seductive and genuinely dangerous vampire women of Toussaint, were originally planned to appear somewhere within the base game itself, before ultimately being cut from the final release and saved instead for the later Blood and Wine expansion, when time finally allowed for their return. Their long absence from the main story, despite clearly being an established part of the setting's mythology, dating all the way back to the very first Witcher game released years earlier, remains an unexplained gap in the continent's wider vampire population that the story itself never directly addresses or acknowledges in any dialogue. The Duchess's buried past. Anna Henrietta, reigning Duchess of Toussaint, quietly harbors a family history soaked in old betrayal, painful exile, and buried violence that only fully surfaces once Sienna's own complicated story is finally unearthed by Geralt. How much of Toussaint's famously sunny, idyllic public reputation has actually been quietly built atop this buried family trauma is left for thoughtful players to consider long after the credits on that particular expansion have already rolled. The Knight Who Never Draws. Deep in a Skellige dungeon, tied to a quest involving a druid's mask, Geralt stumbles upon a sword lodged firmly in stone, an obvious loving homage to old Arthurian legend. When he attempts to pull it free, Yennefer offers a blunt, almost comedic reveal that the sword isn't magically fused into the rock at all, but simply held in place by a mundane iron vise, undercutting the whole fantasy in one dry remark. A second, unrelated nod to the same legend appears later in the Blood and Wine expansion, where a side quest called There Can Be Only One borrows its very name from a completely different sword, bearing story about immortal duelists. Whether these repeated winks at the same old legend were meant as gentle satire of chivalric myth, or simply a favorite joke the writers couldn't resist repeating, is left entirely up to each individual player's own interpretation. The Council that never explains itself. Toussaint operates under a code of chivalry, so strict and formal it borders on genuine absurdity, with elaborate duels, public trials, and rigid formal challenges dictating much of its everyday justice system. The game treats this largely as charming regional flavor rather than a serious plot point, yet the practical mechanics of how such an old-fashioned ceremonial system manages to survive intact in a wider world of crossbows and constant warfare elsewhere is never really questioned by anyone actually living inside its borders. The vintage no one can explain. Toussaint's celebrated wine, prized and traded across the entire continent, is repeatedly described in almost mystical, reverent terms by the game's own characters, tied so closely to the region's very identity and lasting prosperity. Yet nothing in the surrounding lore ever fully clarifies whether there's something genuinely magical about the local soil, the grapes themselves, or the careful process behind it, or whether its glowing reputation is simply built on very good marketing and centuries of patient, well-cultivated tradition. The land that time forgot. Toussaint remains almost entirely untouched by the brutal wars ravaging the northern kingdoms and Nilfgaard throughout the rest of the game's map. A strange, sun-drenched island of peace and quiet prosperity in an otherwise deeply brutal setting. How exactly this small duchy has managed to avoid the conflicts consuming absolutely everyone around it is treated largely as simple regional luck, rather than a deliberate, examined plot point. Though it does quietly raise the question of what, or perhaps who, has kept the wars so conveniently far away from its borders for so long. The sea that answers to no god. Skellige's proud, hardened people worship the gods of the sea, alongside the beloved goddess Freya. Yet the game leaves the actual nature of these deities frustratingly vague throughout every conversation and every shrine. Are they distant, indifferent cosmic forces? Genuinely active entities watching from somewhere unseen? Or simply comforting names given to the unpredictable, dangerous ocean itself? The distinction matters enormously to a culture built entirely around seafaring, raiding, and survival. And the game never quite settles the question either way, leaving it comfortably in the realm of quiet faith. Freya's quiet power. Revered above every other deity throughout Skellige, Freya is respectfully called the Great Modron, meaning mother, and closely tied to fertility, love, and physical beauty in equal measure. Yet unlike many familiar mythological patrons found elsewhere, she never physically appears or directly intervenes anywhere in the unfolding story. Her considerable influence exists entirely through quiet ritual and unwavering belief instead, which raises a naturally quiet, lingering question. Is she simply a comforting myth invented for a hard, dangerous seafaring life, or something genuinely watching from somewhere beyond the endless waves? The ritual of Ragnar Rug. Skellige's people speak often, and with real dread, of Ragnar Rug, an apocalyptic final battle clearly modelled quite directly on the Old Norse concept of Ragnarok. Yet the game never fully clarifies whether this is meant as literal, unavoidable prophecy, or simply cultural memory borrowed from older, half-remembered beliefs. Its looming, ever-present shadow throughout Skellige's mythology suggests real cultural weight behind the legend, even as the exact specifics remain frustratingly undefined for anyone hoping for a clear answer. The giant building, his own doomsday, an ice giant encountered during Geralt's cold travels through Skellige, is slowly revealed to be constructing his own private version of the mythical ship, meant one day to carry the dead into that final battle against the gods themselves. The game draws a direct, deliberate line here to Old Norse legend, yet it leaves entirely unanswered just how close this determined giant might actually be to succeeding in his lonely task. Or what exactly would happen to all of Skellige if his very personal apocalypse ever finally set sail from its icy shore. The Elven Tower on Viking shores. A curiously placed elven tower exists somewhere upon the Isles of Skellige, a culture otherwise defined almost entirely by proud Norse-inspired human clans, rather than any real elven history or presence. Why such a distinctly elven structure exists there at all, seemingly disconnected from the older elven ruins found elsewhere across the continent, is a small detail the game quietly raises without ever fully resolving, hinting gently at older, unwritten chapters of Skellige's history, still waiting somewhere to be told. The faith beneath the faith. Careful scholars of the wider setting have long noted just how deeply elven influence seems to run beneath Skellige's supposedly purely human beliefs, suggesting the island's entire religion may in fact be a blend of two very different cultures, merged so thoroughly over countless generations that neither side even remembers anymore where one clearly ends and the other quietly begins. Old draft writings tied to the game's development even describe a ritual known as an alder walk and a mysterious figure called Lieb Olmai, woven into these early Skellige beliefs. fragments of a much older elven presence that never made it fully into the final release story. The game hints gently at this layered, tangled history, mostly through subtle environmental world-building, rather than through any direct, spoken exposition. The bear who remembers the bagpipes. Skellige's fierce warriors are famously known to fight alongside domesticated bears in open battle, a striking detail rooted deeply in the Isle's close, almost spiritual bond with the surrounding natural world. The game never fully explains how or precisely when this striking practice of training bears specifically for warfare actually began, treating it instead as simply one more accepted, almost mundane fact about a culture otherwise defined chiefly by raiding, sailing, and storytelling gathered warmly around the fire. The woman who rules by exception. Skellige proudly claims full legal equality between men and women, formally allowing both to train equally in the arts of war and seafaring alike. Yet the game shows repeatedly, through small, quiet moments, just how genuinely difficult it remains in practice for a woman to actually claim a position of true leadership among the clans. This lingering tension between the stated cultural ideal and the lived, day-to-day reality is never resolved outright by the story, left instead as quiet commentary on how slowly deeply held custom actually shifts, even when the law itself has already formally changed. The ghost ship of Hindusfjall. Sailors travelling carefully between the islands of Unskellig and Hindusfjall. During the deep, dark hours of the night, occasionally report glimpsing a spectral ship rising briefly from the churning waves before quietly sinking back beneath the surface once more. The game never confirms exactly what this eerie vessel actually is, whether the ghosts of lost sailors long since drowned, some ancient regional curse, or something tied more directly to the Wild Hunt's own legendary ship, leaving it as one of Skellige's quieter, more atmospheric unsolved mysteries. The Vikings who never called themselves. That Skellige's rich culture draws so directly and so deliberately from real-world Norse and Gaelic history that the resemblance borders on intentional loving homage rather than simple coincidence, right down to the archipelago's own name closely echoing real islands found off the coast of Ireland. Whether this careful parallel is meant purely as flavorful creative inspiration, or carries some deeper thematic intention about migration, memory, and cultural blending, is left quietly for players to puzzle over on their own, long after they've sailed on toward other shores. The fortune beneath the waves. According to lore tied closely to the standalone card game set within this same world, a Redanian crew once unearthed treasure of truly immense value, somewhere in the cold waters near Skellige, many generations before Geralt's own story even begins. Whatever became of that legendary fortune, or the fate of the crew that first discovered it, is never once addressed within the main game itself, leaving it as just one of many small buried histories scattered quietly across the windswept archipelago. The cell built for a king who never came. Tucked away into a remote, forgotten corner of Skellige sits a prison cell carved directly into the raw cliffside, with one entire side left exposed openly to the wind and the churning sea far below. Inside, the remains of a dwarf are eventually found, seemingly caught mid-escape attempt long ago and never freed. Sharp-eyed travelers have noted the remains bear an unmistakable resemblance to a certain famous dwarf from a very different fictional world entirely, a quiet visual joke tucked into a genuinely grim setting. No quest marker, no journal entry, and no local legend ever fully explains who originally built this cell, who exactly it was meant to hold, or why it was simply left in the end to the patient in different elements. the white who refuse to fight. Skellige and the surrounding swamps are home to whites, undead creatures typically defined by little more than mindless aggression in most fantasy stories. Yet the game quietly reveals that most whites would honestly rather be left entirely alone to brew strange concoctions over their cauldrons than fight anyone at all. Only when their claimed territory feels genuinely threatened do they lash out, summoning smaller bar guests to their defense before retreating once more into long stretches of quiet hibernation. Why this particular strain of the undead evolved such a passive, almost domestic temperament compared to their far more violent necrophage cousins is a small, quiet mystery. The game's own bestiary never quite bothers to unpack. The spotted whites that vanished, buried within the careful lore of blood and wine, is a passing mention of the spotted white, a supposedly far more dangerous variant of the ordinary white that witchers of an earlier generation apparently hunted almost to the very edge of extinction. If witchers so thoroughly wiped out this larger, more dangerous strain generations before Geralt was even born, the presence of one still lurking in Toussaint centuries later raises a quiet question. The game never directly answers. Was this single creature always hidden away safely, untouched by that ancient purge? Or does its sudden reappearance suggest the species was never quite as extinct as the old Witcher records so confidently like to claim? The message from another world. Hidden within a later update to the game, players discovered a strange sequence of letters and numbers etched onto a statue, one that directly mirrors an entirely unsolved mystery from a completely different CD Projekt Red game. Set centuries in the future, the symbols match precisely, suggesting some deliberate, deeper connection between these two seemingly unrelated worlds, and yet neither game has ever offered players a real answer. Entire communities of dedicated fans have spent years attempting to decode the meaning behind it, without a single confirmed solution surfacing from the developers themselves, leaving it one of gaming's quietest ongoing riddles. The forest that remembers every kill. Careful, observant players have noticed that the wilderness surrounding Geralt genuinely seems to respond to his actions over time, with wolf populations visibly thinning in areas where he hunts them heavily, only for deer populations to rise noticeably in their place shortly afterward. Kill enough deer instead, and the wolves themselves eventually wander off in search of prey elsewhere. The game never explicitly announces this quiet ecosystem simulation running beneath the surface, choosing instead to let patient, attentive players simply stumble upon it through their own hours of exploration, a small hidden testament to just how alive this world was quietly built to feel. The rabbit from Camelot. Deep in the wilderness, players occasionally stumble upon a small white rabbit that, on closer inspection, behaves with an oddly specific menace, a clear and deliberate nod to the legendary killer rabbit from a beloved British comedy troupe's take on Arthurian legend. It doesn't announce itself, doesn't glow, doesn't sit beside a quest marker waiting patiently to be found. It simply exists out there in the grass, indistinguishable from any other harmless critter, until it very much isn't. Why the developers chose to hide such a specific niche reference so deep into an already massive open world, rather than somewhere more visible where more players might notice it, is part of what makes it so beloved among longtime fans who stumbled onto it by pure accident during an otherwise ordinary hunting trip, only to freeze in place the moment they realized exactly what they were looking at. The wooden ghost finally solved. For years after release, players whispered nervously about a strange wooden ghost figure discovered inside an abandoned tower on Fyke Isle, tied to a fleeting shadow that appears on Geralt's boat during an early main quest as he rose quietly toward the aisle in the fog. Entire forum threads and video essays were built around the figure, with theories ranging from cut content to a genuine, unfinished haunting the developers never got around to explaining before shipping the game. The mystery went unsolved for the better part of a decade, until a former developer finally explained, years later, that the figure was simply a placeholder object, an invisible marker allowing Geralt to hold a conversation with a nearby sorceress without her physically appearing on screen during that particular scripted scene. The answer, once it finally arrived, felt almost anticlimactic compared to the years of ghost stories that had grown up around it. Though some fans still preferred to believe there was something more genuinely haunting the old tower all along, developer explanation or not. The commander who never returned. Yorveth, the fierce elven commander of the Scoia'tael resistance and a defining character from the previous chapter of the saga, simply never appears in Wild Hunt at all, despite other major figures from that same game making their way back into the story in one form or another, including old rivals and old allies alike. No death is confirmed, no letter explains his absence, and no passing mention offers even a hint of where he ended up after the war moved north toward Novigrad and beyond into Skellige and Tucson. For a character so beloved by players who fought alongside him through an entire game's worth of moral complexity and hard, divisive choices, his silent removal from the narrative remains one of the saga's more quietly disappointing loose ends. A beloved face simply erased from the story without so much as a farewell scene or a single mourner to speak his name. The dragon who vanished. Saskia, the dragon disguised as a human queen who ruled over the newly founded state of Vergen in the previous game, is mentioned only briefly in Wild Hunt, in passing dialogue noting that Nilfgaard's armies eventually swallowed the valley she once protected during their relentless northern campaign. What became of Saskia herself during that conquest, whether she fought to the last as both dragon and queen, fled into hiding to wait out the war, or fell defending the people who once called her their ruler, is never addressed anywhere in the game's text or dialogue. It's possible the writers simply couldn't commit to a single canon outcome given how differently her story could end depending on the choices players made in the earlier game, leaving her fate permanently suspended somewhere between memory and myth, much like the valley itself. The sword, named after a direwolf, one of the most powerful blades available to Geralt over the course of his journey, shares its exact name with a legendary sword wielded by a young lord in a very different fantasy saga entirely, one built around ice, fire, and warring houses locked in endless conflict over a throne shaped like a chair of blades. Whether this was meant as an affectionate wink to fans of both properties, or simply a coincidence born from how many fantasy authors draw on similar naming conventions rooted in old heraldic tradition and the shared language of swords and steel, has never been directly addressed by the developers themselves in any interview. It remains a quiet detail that rewards players who happen to notice it, tucked into an inventory screen, rather than announced with any fanfare or accompanying lore entry explaining the choice. The voice behind the Emperor. Emperor Emir var Emreis, one of the most coldly calculating rulers in the entire saga, is voiced in the English language version by an actor famous for playing an equally calculating patriarch in a beloved television drama about warring noble families locked in a decades-long struggle for power and succession. The casting choice feels almost too perfect once noticed. The same measured, dangerous calm carried over from one throne room to another, entirely different one, built from stone and ambition, rather than snow and ice. And yet, the game itself never winks at the audience about it, never breaks the fourth wall or draws attention to the parallel in dialogue or cutscene. leaving it as a quiet reward for anyone who recognizes the voice the moment Emir first speaks his opening lines. The club no one talks about. Within the heavily guarded Nilfgaardian war camp in Velen sits a private officers' club called the House of Respite, normally sealed off entirely to outsiders and even to most ordinary soldiers stationed just outside its walls day and night. The only way inside is to acquire and wear a full set of Nilfgaardian armor, tricking the guards into treating Geralt as one of their own long enough to slip past the entrance unquestioned and into the quiet interior beyond. Once inside, there's remarkably little to actually do. No unique quest, no hidden treasure, no secret conversation waiting to be triggered by a curious witcher in stolen colors, which raises the quiet question of why such an elaborate, exclusive space was built into the game world at all, if its purpose was never meant to matter to the wider story unfolding just beyond its walls. The cat who wasn't there. During a quest involving a wandering cat school witcher encountered in the swamps of Velen, keen-eared players have picked up on a lengthy, oddly specific joke buried in the dialogue that references a famous thought experiment from quantum physics involving a sealed box, a cat, and an uncertain fate hanging somewhere between life and death. Why a medieval fantasy witcher would casually reference 20th century theoretical physics, delivered with a perfectly straight face, and no acknowledgement of how strange the reference actually is never explained by the writers. It stands as one of the more delightfully anachronistic jokes the team snuck past most players entirely, tucked into a conversation easy to rush through without noticing. The life that never stops. Fast traveling to the sun-soaked town of Fox Hollow in Toussaint reveals an almost overwhelming number of unique background animations playing out among its ordinary townsfolk, far more than nearly any other settlement in the game, including some of the larger, more narratively important cities elsewhere on the map that see far more actual quest traffic. Bakers knead dough behind open windows. Children play chasing games through narrow alleys lined with drying laundry, and merchants haggle animatedly over prices at every corner, all without a single quest attached to any of it. Why this particular town receives such disproportionate attention to ambient life compared to larger, seemingly more important settlements elsewhere remains an open question about the specific, perhaps personal priorities of whichever developer was responsible for populating it during the long crunch of development. The Forgotten Boy of Kaer Morhen. South of the ruined Witcher stronghold of Kaer Morhen sits a small, easily missed grave dedicated to a young Witcher trainee named Leo, a war orphan discovered and taken in around the year 1264, who was killed defending the keep during an assault by a criminal organization years before the events of the main game. Geralt pauses briefly to reflect on the boy's death if the grave is found, recalling how Leo showed real promise despite having not yet undergone the mutations that would have made him a full Witcher. Yet nothing more is ever said about him elsewhere in the story, leaving his brief, tragic life almost entirely dependent on players who wander far enough off the beaten path to notice the weathered marker at all. The cave that remembers training. Northwest of Kaer Morhen lies a hidden cave that triggers a haunting secondary quest, forcing Geralt to relive fragments of his own brutal trial as a young Witcher apprentice. The grueling process known across the continent as the Trial of the Grasses, a rite so dangerous that only a fraction of boys who undergo it ever survive to become full Witchers. Why this particular cave holds such a powerful echo of that traumatic experience, when no other location in the game triggers anything similar, is never explained. though it does suggest the mountains around Kaer Morhen may hold far more buried memory, grief, and trauma than the game ever fully unpacks in its main storyline. The Harpies of northern Ard Skellig. Sailing carefully around the northernmost edge of Ard Skellig, hugging close to the coastline near the ancient crypt, reveals one of the most easily missed quests in the entire game, involving a man named Jorg besieged by a flock of harpies circling overhead. Rescuing him from certain death unlocks a further, deeper mystery. Geralt can choose to investigate if curiosity gets the better of him. One that hints at something more unsettling lurking behind Jorg's initial plea for help. Because the location requires such specific, deliberate exploration entirely by boat, many players never encounter this thread at all, leaving its fuller implications a genuine unknown for most who finish the game without ever setting sail that far north. The funeral. No one explains. In the small Skellige village of Rongne, careful travelers can witness the quiet funeral procession of a victim named Greta, a somber scene tucked away with no accompanying quest marker, no journal entry, and no dialogue offering any explanation of who Greta was or how they died. It exists purely as atmosphere, a glimpse of ordinary grief in a world usually preoccupied with monsters, kings, and prophecy. Mourners gathered quietly around a modest pyre as life in the village continues around them. Its complete lack of context is precisely what makes it feel so unexpectedly real. A small human moment the game never asks players to notice at all. The wooden watchers of Skellige, scattered throughout the Isles, are strange, roughly carved wooden figures standing sentinel near paths and cliff tops, tied to no quest and offering no reward for those who find them. A developer who worked directly on these figures later explained in an online discussion that they were added purely to reinforce the deep spiritual connection between the Skelligers and the natural world around them. A visual shorthand for a culture that reveres its land and its dead in equal measure. It's a rare case of a Witcher 3 mystery actually being solved by its own creators, though the figures themselves remain quietly unsettling to stumble upon alone in the fog, long shadows stretching out from their weathered faces. The Forger's family, secret. Early in Geralt's journey toward Novigrad, a shady document forger offers a discounted travel pass in exchange for a favor involving his brother-in-law, who is out scavenging a nearby battlefield alongside a group of desperate peasants picking through the dead for anything of value. The quest itself resolves quickly enough, a short detour through corpses and looted armor, but the underlying implication that entire families in Velen have turned to looting corpses and forging papers simply to survive the endless war lingers long after the quest marker disappears from the map. It's a quiet commentary on just how far ordinary people had been pushed by the fighting consuming the region around them. The sorcerer saved by seconds. At the extravagant Vegelbud masquerade, a haughty sorcerer named Moritz treats Triss with open contempt during an early conversation, sneering at her with an air of superiority that feels almost designed to make players dislike him instantly. The tables turn dramatically later on, however, when witch hunters catch and nearly execute him for the very magic he'd been so arrogant about only moments before. A brief window exists for Geralt to intervene and save his life before the flames are lit, and if he does, Moritz quietly rejoins Triss's circle later in the story, without any further acknowledgement of his earlier arrogance or the debt he now owes. Whether this small act of mercy was meant to say something about redemption, or simply exists as an easily missed bonus for attentive players, is left entirely unaddressed by the story. The egg that saves a life. During the events of Blood and Wine, a specific and fairly obscure ritual involving an egg, allows players to save the life of a character named Vivian, who would otherwise be lost entirely to whatever curse or fate awaits her. The solution is tucked away without much fanfare, hidden behind a very particular sequence of choices that rewards only players who happen to stumble upon the right combination of steps through trial, error, or outside knowledge. Why such a meaningful, life-altering outcome was hidden so thoroughly, rather than made more discoverable through hints or dialogue, remains a small but genuine curiosity about the expansion's overall design philosophy. The achievement only chefs notice. Completionist players who track down all 12 formulas needed to brew a particular potent potion are rewarded with an achievement called Let's Cook, a title that quietly winks at a certain famous chemistry-themed crime drama without ever directly referencing it by name or acknowledging the connection in any way. The joke works precisely because it never announces itself. Tucked away in a menu, most players glance past without a second thought on their way to the next quest. Only those already primed to notice the reference will catch the layered meaning behind what looks, at first glance, like an entirely innocent title. The bear in the red shirt. Somewhere among the forests of the continent, hidden among the game's otherwise aggressive wildlife, players can occasionally find a bear wearing a distinctly red-colored shirt, an unmistakable and deliberate nod to a beloved children's book character known for his fondness for honey and his gentle, bumbling nature. Whether this particular bear behaves any differently than his unclothed counterparts once combat begins, or simply exists as a visual joke waiting quietly to be discovered by a wandering hunter, adds a small note of unexpected warmth to what would otherwise be just another dangerous forest encounter. The farting trolls of the depths. Deep within an unmarked cave system, players can occasionally hear a distinctly crude, unmistakable sound, long before they see its source, eventually rounding a corner to discover a group of trolls seemingly having the time of their lives entirely undisturbed by anything resembling danger. Approaching turns the encounter hostile almost instantly, cutting short what might otherwise be one of the game's more oddly wholesome moments of pure comedic relief. It's a small, comedic beat tucked away for anyone patient enough to explore off the marked path, rewarding curiosity with laughter rather than loot. The graves that name the developers. A cemetery in Toussaint contains a cluster of humorous, oddly specific epitaphs carved into weathered headstones, several of which turn out to reference actual members of the development team by name, framed as absurd in-universe deaths related directly to their real-world job titles back at the studio. It's a light-hearted tradition seen in other beloved games as well. A small wink from the people who built the world to anyone patient enough to actually read every gravestone. The Witcher 3's version stands out for just how specific and genuinely well-written each individual joke actually is, rewarding a slow, careful read rather than a quick glance. The Horse Who Finally Talks, a rare and easily missed side quest, allows Geralt to brew a strange concoction that temporarily grants him the ability to understand his loyal steed, Roach, in full conversational detail for the very first time. The resulting dialogue is equal parts funny and quietly sad, touching on why witchers traditionally never bother naming their horses individually, given how often they're lost to the dangers of the open road, a small tradition born from a lifetime of loss rather than simple forgetfulness. Once the effect wears off, the game never revisits the idea again, leaving it a strange, bittersweet oddity that most players only ever experience once. The vampire who just wants to know the date. Deep within the sewers beneath Novigrad, a quest involving a professor and a mysterious locked sarcophagus reveals a surprisingly polite vampire hidden inside, who asks only what year it currently is before promptly telling everyone to leave him alone and sealing himself back inside the moment he hears the answer, apparently satisfied that the world outside still isn't ready for him. The joke lands entirely on comedic timing, rather than any deeper narrative payoff, and the vampire's actual identity, his history, or his reason for hiding away in a sewer sarcophagus in the first place is never explored any further by the quest itself, left forever as a closed lid and an unanswered question. The Pepper Under the Bridge, within the whimsical storybook-inspired Land of 1,000 Fables, a bridge hides a small red pepper tucked beneath it, a subtle reference to a famous rock song about addiction, longing, and the city of Los Angeles. The connection requires players to already know the song in question to appreciate it at all, and even then it takes a moment of genuine recognition before the joke lands, making it one of the more purely optional references scattered throughout the game's more fantastical corners of the map. The tattoo that crossed games, players who completed a specific drinking contest in the previous chapter of the saga, resulting in Geralt waking up with an unfortunate and rather embarrassing tattoo, can carry that same tattoo forward into Wild Hunt if they choose not to have it removed beforehand during that earlier game. The detail rewards long-term players who imported their save file across multiple installments of the series, a small but genuinely clever piece of continuity that most newcomers jumping straight into Wild Hunt would never even know to look for on Geralt's own skin. The line borrowed from a mobster film. After completing a specific quest in Crookback Bog, an ordinary witch hunter can be overheard delivering a line lifted almost verbatim from a beloved crime drama film about organized crime in Boston, right down to the exact cadence and rhythm of the original delivery. It's a small, purely optional wink toward film fans, tucked into a single throwaway line of ambient dialogue that most players will walk straight past without ever triggering the encounter or noticing the reference at all. The drunk who quoted a comedian. In the vineyards of Beauclair, a wandering drunkard can occasionally be heard shouting an enthusiastic, nonsensical phrase instantly recognizable to fans of a certain fictional journalist character, known for his broken English and outlandish public exclamations. The reference requires no context whatsoever to enjoy, landing purely as a burst of absurd, out-of-place comedy in an otherwise serious fantasy setting built around vampires and vengeance, a small reminder that the writers never took their own world too seriously. The bonfire beneath Toussaint. After a difficult fight against a giant atop a towering beanstalk during the events of Blood and Wine, a hidden cave beneath the battle site contains a sword stuck into the ground beside a lit fire, an unmistakable homage to the resting points found throughout a famously difficult action game series known for testing player patience. Players can even claim the sword for themselves afterward and use it in later fights, making the reference more than just a visual joke, a genuinely useful reward for anyone who takes the time to look beneath the beanstalk after the battle ends. The photograph on the mountain. Atop the tallest peak in all of Toussaint sits a small hidden photograph of the actual development team who built the expansion, placed in a location so remote that reaching it under normal gameplay conditions is effectively impossible without external tools or console commands to bypass the game's usual boundaries. Why the developers chose to hide something so personal in a spot almost no ordinary player could ever organically discover speaks to a certain quiet private pride in work that was never meant to be widely seen, a gift left for themselves as much as for anyone else. the symbol nobody asked to keep. Somewhere within the game exists a small, deliberate reference to the acronym for Digital Rights Management, a system the game's own developers have publicly criticized in interviews and chosen not to use for their own releases, preferring instead to trust their players outright. Tucking a wry nod to that stance directly into the game itself reflects a company culture that has always taken quiet pride in that trust, turning a genuine business philosophy into a small, easily missed inside joke for anyone who happens to notice it. The boy who wasn't a Witcher, according to Yennefer's own recollection, shared quietly during a conversation most players could easily rush straight past without a second thought. The Kaer Morhen massacre claimed 23 Witchers and 40 students in a single brutal night. Boys who had trained for years under Vesemir's watch, but never lived long enough to complete their final transformation into something more than simply human. Their names are barely recorded anywhere in the game itself, reduced to a single grim number recited almost in passing, a cold statistic rather than a proper roll call of the dead deserving remembrance. What happened to the bodies of those 40 unfinished students? Whether they were buried with any real ceremony at all in the frozen mountain soil, or simply left scattered where they fell among the burning ruins of their only home, is never addressed anywhere by the story. It's a strange kind of silence for a game that otherwise takes such visible, deliberate care naming its dead. From lowly peasants drowned in the swamp to kings struck down on distant battlefields, and yet lets an entire generation of young witchers in training pass by almost anonymously, remembered only as a head count recited once and never spoken of again. The mages who helped burn the keep. The mob that destroyed Kaer Morhen should never have been capable of breaching a fortress deliberately built to be unreachable by ordinary men. Tucked deep into the mountains along a trail so treacherous, young witchers themselves nicknamed it the Killer long before any siege ever came. The game and its surrounding lore quietly agree that mages must have assisted the attackers somehow, likely opening a way in through hastily prepared portals or carefully stripping away whatever ancient magical wards once protected the keep from exactly this kind of coordinated assault. Yet not one of these mages is ever named, not in the game itself, not in any of the wider historical texts scattered across the world for players willing to read them closely. Whoever helped turn a peasant mob armed with little more than torches and pitchforks into a force genuinely capable of ending an entire Witcher school in a single night, walked away from history entirely unaccountable. Their names lost the same way so much else about that terrible night was lost to fire and time, and the game seems entirely content to let that anonymity stand undisturbed, a debt of blood nobody was ever forced to answer for. The Witcher who fled the wall. Among the small handful of witchers who stood together to defend Kaer Morhen, during its single darkest night, one named Rindert the Wraith reportedly broke and ran partway through the desperate battle, according to older accounts of the siege passed down mostly outside the main game itself. What became of him afterward? Whether shame drove him into hiding somewhere far from any other Witcher who might recognize his face or his name, or whether the guilt simply followed him quietly for the rest of his long, solitary days out on the path, is never explored anywhere in Wild Hunt's own text. It's a small, deeply human detail, buried inside a story otherwise built almost entirely around witchers who never flinch, never hesitate, and never once show fear even in their absolute final moments of life. It raises a quiet, uncomfortable question about what exactly the path does to a person who breaks beneath it even a single time, and whether such a man, having once run, can ever truly return to that life again without carrying the weight of that one moment with him forever. The four who cast as one. When the final witches still standing at Kaer Morhen realized they couldn't possibly hold the courtyard against the advancing mob much longer, four of them reportedly linked arms together in that final desperate moment and cast the Ard sign together in perfect practiced unison, unleashing a single combined shockwave powerful enough to kill dozens of their attackers in one devastating, blinding instant. The spell's own violent backlash apparently killed all four casters in turn, a small, tragic detail so easy to overlook entirely that most players never even learn of this final sacrificial act at all during their playthrough. How exactly four separate, exhausted witches managed to coordinate such a precisely combined casting under that kind of overwhelming, chaotic pressure? A technique never once demonstrated or even casually mentioned anywhere else across the entire series, remains a small but genuine mechanical mystery the game never revisits, explains, or teaches players to replicate for themselves in any later chapter. The priestesses who arrived too late. Priestesses from a nearby temple devoted entirely to the goddess Melitele were reportedly the very first outsiders to reach Kaer Morhen, after the massacre had already run its full, terrible course, arriving on foot to find a once proud fortress emptied of nearly everyone who had called its drafty stone halls home for generations before that night. What exactly they found waiting for them there among the ash and the dead? What quiet rites they ultimately performed for so many unnamed bodies? And why a temple devoted specifically to healing, motherhood, and gentle mercy would be the ones fate chose to answer? That particular grim and bloody call is never explored within the game itself in any real depth. It's left standing as only the faintest historical footnote, tucked quietly into supplementary lore for players patient and curious enough to go digging past whatever the main story bothers to show them directly on screen, whether their temple kept any written record of what they witnessed that day, and whether such a record might still survive somewhere in a dusty archive is a question the game never raises, and certainly never answers. The woven scenes. No one explains. Inside the main hall of Kaer Morhen hang 3 separate weathered wall hangings that Geralt can examine and comment on individually if players ever think to actually interact with them at all during their many visits to the keep, each one apparently depicting some quiet scene drawn from the keep's long, largely unrecorded history stretching back centuries. The game offers players only Geralt's brief, characteristically dry, almost dismissive remarks rather than any real, substantial historical context about who actually wove them, precisely when in the keep's long history, or what specific events they were originally meant to preserve and honor for future generations of witchers to remember and learn from. For a keep so thoroughly stripped of its own written history by fire, mob violence, and the simple slow passage of time, these 3 quiet, easily overlooked woven images may genuinely be some of the only surviving physical records left of a much longer, richer story, and even they go almost entirely uninterpreted by anyone who still calls the ruined keep home today. The elven stones beneath the keep. Scholars within the wider setting speculate at length that Kaer Morhen itself was originally built directly atop an even older elven defensive structure, evidence pointed to in the form of a ring of ancient standing stones known as the Circle of Whispering Stones, still found scattered nearby the keep's outer walls to this very day. If elves genuinely once held this exact stretch of remote coastline, centuries upon centuries before any human witcher ever set foot there to train and suffer through the trial of the grasses. The keep's entire true history stretches back considerably further than even Vesemir himself. Its oldest living resident and last true keeper seems to fully understand or openly acknowledge to Geralt why the elves eventually abandoned this particular site entirely, and what exactly those ancient standing stones were originally built to accomplish, honor, or protect against, is left as pure, entirely unresolved speculation for anyone patient. Enough to wonder about it long after the credits have already rolled and the fire has burned low. The amulet nobody explains. Buried deep within the game's own unused development files, but cut entirely before the game's eventual release, are two small items tied directly to the Bloody Baron's already tragic questline: a simple wooden amulet and a personal dagger belonging to the Baron himself, both apparently meant to play some larger, more concrete role in uncovering his shattered family's true fate than what ultimately made it into the finished release product. Neither item made it into the final version of the quest in any meaningful, discoverable way that ordinary players might stumble across during a normal playthrough, leaving only their raw, buried data behind as quiet evidence they once genuinely existed at all. What clue, twist, or piece of evidence they were originally designed to reveal to sufficiently observant players remains a small, genuinely unsolved mystery of development history, rather than in game lore itself. Exactly the kind of loose thread that only ever surfaces when someone goes digging through files never meant to be seen by the public at all. The dagger with no purpose. Alongside that same cut amulet sits an equally unused personal dagger, tied to that identical unfinished thread running through the Baron's already deeply tragic story of family, war, and slow ruin. Whether it was originally meant to serve as physical evidence of violence committed within that particular household, a weapon Anna herself may have once used to defend against her own increasingly abusive husband, or simply a red herring cut somewhere along the way for pure pacing reasons during the story's notoriously long development process, is genuinely impossible to determine now without CD Projekt Red's original design documents, which were never released publicly to fans or historians. It's exactly the kind of quiet, permanently unfinished detail that strongly suggests the Baron's entire tragedy was originally scripted to unfold, with even more tangible physical evidence for careful players to piece together on their own than what ultimately survived into the polished version we all actually got to experience and play through ourselves. The line borrowed from a crime film. While investigating the Baron's own basement during the pivotal Family Matters questline, a guard and one of his fellow henchmen can be overheard casually discussing the need to bring out, quote, the GIMP, a phrase lifted almost word for word from a famous 1990s American crime film built around a tangle of interconnected Los Angeles criminals and their overlapping, violent fates. In the actual context of this scene, the two men are simply referring to Uma, kept restrained somewhere nearby in the cold dark, but the reference itself has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the Baron's own unfolding plot, existing purely as a small, knowing wink toward attentive film fans, tucked quietly into background dialogue that the overwhelming majority of players will walk straight past without ever once pausing to listen closely enough to catch it. The letter that changed everything. Tucked away quietly inside Tamara's own abandoned bedroom sits a single, unassuming letter addressed directly to her, one that strongly hints at the much deeper, darker truth of her entire family's situation well before Geralt officially uncovers any of it properly through the main questline itself. Players who choose to skip searching her bedroom entirely, which the quest doesn't technically require them to do in order to progress the story forward, end up missing this small but meaningful piece of foreshadowing completely, along with an unsettling little doll and several other quietly telling household details scattered nearby. The letter itself is never once brought up again by any character once it's found and read, existing purely as a small, quiet reward for genuinely thorough searching, rather than becoming a plot point the wider story ever bothers circling back around to properly revisit or reference later on. The god nobody prays to twice, hidden inside a locked basement room within the Baron's own family home, sits a small, private, carefully maintained altar devoted entirely to the eternal fire, discovered by Geralt alongside a heavy iron key and a stick of fragrant incense tucked away quietly in Tamara's own bedroom upstairs. It strongly suggests that Tamara had, in complete secret and without her father's knowledge, already turned toward the very same fanatical faith that burns mages and non-humans alive in Novigrad's crowded, fearful streets. A small but telling detail that quietly recontextualizes her later choice to formally join the witch hunters as something that had clearly been building for a long while before Geralt ever even arrives at Crow's Perch to begin investigating. Why she turned specifically toward that particular faith in a household already so thoroughly full of private suffering, violence, and quiet desperation is left entirely for players themselves to infer on their own from the scattered physical evidence alone. The choice that was never really a choice. At the raw emotional climax of Anna's long, painful story, Geralt is forced to choose between two seemingly identical dolls in order to determine whether her curse lifts safely and gently, or instead ends abruptly in sudden, consuming flame. Yet either outcome the player selects ultimately leads to her death, regardless of which specific doll gets picked up first in that final moment. The crone's own final, cruelest trick ties the curse itself directly and inseparably to a remaining life force, meaning that hard-won freedom and inevitable death arrive as the very same single event, no matter what the player ultimately decides to do in that quiet, heavy moment. It's a rare and genuinely devastating case of the game, presenting what feels, in the moment, like a deeply meaningful, weighty choice that was, from the very beginning of the encounter, never actually a real choice at all in any way that mattered. Many players report replaying this exact moment multiple times, convinced they must be missing some hidden solution, only to discover the game simply never offered one to begin with. The father who vanishes from the story. Depending on exactly how Geralt chooses to handle the final stretch of Anna's difficult rescue, the bloody Baron himself can simply walk out of the wider narrative entirely, heading off alone into the misty depths of Crookback Bog on one final desperate search for some cure that may not even exist, with the game's own closing text openly admitting, in plain language, that his ultimate fate afterward is, quote, a tale for another time that will never actually be told. Did he die out there alone in the swamp, searching for a cure that was never truly coming for either of them? Did he wander that bog for years afterward instead, slowly losing himself to grief the same painful way Anna once did before him? The very story that built one of the most widely acclaimed and emotionally devastating character arcs in the entire game ultimately refuses, quite deliberately and on purpose, to ever close its own book on him. The botchling's second chance. When Anna's own unborn child is eventually discovered buried hastily, without so much as a proper name given to it, it slowly curdles over time into a botchling, a restless undead creature born specifically from parental neglect and unresolved grief, according to old Slavic folklore, the game draws directly and quite deliberately from for this entire sequence. Geralt is given the meaningful option to perform a quiet, respectful ritual, naming the child properly at last and burying it with genuine ceremony this time, transforming that same restless creature into a lubberkin instead, a small, gentle, protective household spirit, rather than a monster that simply needs to be destroyed outright. The game never fully clarifies just how widely known or commonly practiced this particular folk remedy actually is among ordinary people living through the endless war in Velen, leaving open the quietly unsettling question of just how many other unnamed, ungrieved botchlings might still be wandering unclaimed somewhere out there across the continent's countless forgotten battlefields. The sword that remembers every master. Aerondite, the genuinely legendary silver sword tied directly to old Arthurian legend and the tale of Lancelot, has appeared in some form across all three mainline Witcher games, always gifted by the very same mysterious, ageless Lady of the Lake, regardless of which particular era of Geralt's long story is currently being told to players. The game's own early descriptive text calls the blade, quote, light, sharp as a razor, and fits the hand neatly, and further adds that it has a destiny entirely its own, without ever once clarifying exactly what that promised destiny actually entails beyond simply, eventually serving whichever Witcher finally proves themselves genuinely worthy enough to hold it properly and honorably. Whether the sword itself somehow carries some faint, lingering sliver of awareness or quiet preference across the passing centuries, or whether that particular phrase is simply old-fashioned flavor text meant to sound suitably mystical and grand, is left entirely open to each individual player's own personal interpretation. The virtue nobody can fake. To finally reclaim Aerondite during the emotional events of Blood and Wine, Geralt must first prove, through genuine action rather than mere words, that he truly embodies 5 entirely separate chivalric virtues: valor, honor, wisdom, compassion, and generosity, each one demonstrated organically through completely unrelated side quests scattered widely across the whole of Toussaint, rather than through any single dedicated formal trial designed specifically for the purpose. The game quietly tracks the player's progress toward all 5 virtues in the background, the entire time, regardless of whether the player actually intends to pursue the legendary sword at all during that particular playthrough of the expansion. How exactly a mystical hermit guarding a lonely, isolated lake somehow came to know, seemingly in real time, whether a wandering Witcher has genuinely proven his own moral worth through quests happening far outside his own direct sight and hearing entirely, is a question the story itself never once bothers to properly address or explain to curious players. The hermit who guards the lake, the reclusive hermit who personally tests Geralt for the right to claim Aerondite, lives entirely alone on a small, quiet island, sitting at the very center of a peaceful lake in Toussaint, and his true identity or ultimate origin is never once properly explained anywhere within the quest itself from start to finish. Is he simply a devoted, humble servant of the ageless Lady of the Lake? Perhaps some lesser-bound spirit given the singular eternal task of testing worthy knights across the centuries? Or something else entirely, wearing a convenient, familiar human shape purely to put nervous visitors at ease before the real test begins? Once Geralt finally manages to defeat him in that closing trial of combat, the hermit vanishes quietly beneath the water's surface, and the lady herself appears calmly in his exact place only moments later, leaving the hermit's own ultimate fate and his own true underlying nature permanently unresolved for anyone curious enough to stop and wonder about it afterward. The gin collector's missing bottles, Geoffrey Monk, a genuinely powerful mage from centuries long past, and one of the very first humans to ever master the ancient magic of the elder races, was famous throughout his own era, specifically for trapping wild jinns inside carefully sealed bottles and forcing each captive spirit in turn to grant him 3 separate wishes before finally, grudgingly releasing it back out into the world once more. Old surviving rumours strongly suggest he kept considerably more than just one such bottle over the long, storied course of his remarkable career, amassing a small but genuinely dangerous collection of captive spirits that few others living during his particular era would have ever dared attempt to control at all themselves. What ultimately became of those many bottles after his own eventual death, whether they were destroyed outright by cautious successors, hidden away somewhere deliberately obscure and forgotten, or simply lost entirely to the slow, indifferent passage of time, is never addressed anywhere within Wild Hunt's own text or lore. The man trapped in a monster's body. For the vast majority of the game's runtime, Uma appears to be little more than a pitiful, grotesque curiosity, kept around purely for cruel entertainment at the Bloody Baron's own rowdy court, right up until the dangerous trial of the grasses finally breaks the ancient curse and reveals the being trapped helplessly inside all along to actually be Avalach, the very same powerful elven sage quietly guiding Ciri throughout the entire wider story from the shadows. The sudden revelation recontextualizes every single earlier scene involving Uma entirely and completely, turning what felt like simple, uncomplicated pity into something far stranger and considerably more unsettling. The very moment players finally realize exactly who was suffering silently behind that ruined, disfigured face the whole time, right under everyone's unsuspecting nose at Crow's Perch, for who knows how long. Replaying the game with that knowledge in mind changes the entire tone of Uma's early scenes completely, turning what once read as slapstick misery into something considerably more tragic in hindsight. The timeline that doesn't add up. Careful, detail-oriented players scouring the story closely have long noted a genuinely strange contradiction in exactly when Avalach was actually first cursed into becoming Uma, since Ciri herself appears to already know all about lifting the curse and casually mentions as much to Dandelion, well before the game's own carefully established internal timeline would logically suggest that particular curse should have even happened yet at all. Fan theories point towards Ciri's own uniquely rare time-traveling abilities as one plausible explanation for the discrepancy, potentially allowing her to somehow interact with a slightly out-of-sequence version of unfolding events, though the game itself never directly addresses this confusion head-on or offers players any single, clean, satisfying resolution to it whatsoever. It remains one of the more openly and enthusiastically debated small plot holes among dedicated fans who enjoy tracking the story's own internal timeline closely across multiple, careful playthroughs of the entire game. The cure that almost killed him, before finally resorting to the genuinely dangerous, potentially fatal trial of the grasses in a last-ditch effort to break Uma's stubborn curse for good. Old Vesemir first quietly attempts an older, considerably gentler traditional Witcher method entirely on his own, taking Uma up into the surrounding snowy mountains alone at the stroke of midnight, and giving him a simple, humble cup of hemlock tea, a folk technique that had apparently worked successfully once before on an entirely different cursed individual, referenced only in passing as the Swan of Povis. This first, gentler attempt at a cure fails completely for reasons the game never bothers to explain in any real satisfying detail, leaving Yennefer's own far riskier and more dangerous magical alternative as genuinely the only remaining option left on the table for anyone involved. The skin beneath his nails, examining Uma closely during his long, miserable time trapped at Crow's Perch. Several observant characters within the story note, shredded, bloodied skin caught stubbornly beneath his own ragged nails, initially assumed by nearly everyone present, including the witches themselves at first, to be leftover physical evidence of a routine beating handed out casually by the Baron's own bored and cruel men. In truth, according to development notes cut before the game's final release, the skin found there is entirely his own, self-inflicted through repeated small acts of violence against himself, a small but disturbing detail. The finished game only ever lightly gestures toward through a small handful of overheard, half-joking remarks from onlookers about him hurting himself for seemingly no clear reason at all. Whether this quiet self-harm actually reflects some deeply repressed guilt from Avallac'h's own long, complicated past, somehow bleeding faintly through the curse and into Uma's simpler, more animal mind, or simply the raw, instinctive panic of a fully aware consciousness trapped somewhere it fundamentally doesn't belong at all, is never spelled out directly or explicitly anywhere by the story itself. The Curse with no author, while later comments and surrounding context strongly suggest Eredin, the ruthless king of the Wild Hunt himself, was ultimately directly responsible for cursing Avallac'h into the pitiful form of Uma as a calculated personal punishment for his growing closeness with Ciri. The game itself never once definitively confirms this popular theory in any single direct conversation, flashback, or dramatized cutscene shown to players. No formal trial, no dramatic confrontation, no single dedicated scene ever actually shows the curse itself being cast, or clearly explains its exact underlying mechanics or true origin point in detail. Players are consequently left to quietly assemble the most likely culprit entirely from scattered implication and purely circumstantial evidence alone. A mystery ultimately solved more through careful, patient process of elimination than through any clear, fully satisfying answer the story itself ever directly and explicitly provides to anyone asking. Some fans have pointed instead toward Avallac'h's own long history of enemies among the Ernele court, suggesting Eredin may simply be the most convenient suspect rather than the confirmed one. The school that vanished from the story. According to a brief, fleeting mystical vision glimpsed only through Erendite's own strange, lingering connection to the ageless Lady of the Lake, the entire powerful lodge of sorceresses apparently ceases to exist entirely at some deliberately undefined point somewhere in the future. Its once formidable members scattered to the winds, imprisoned indefinitely, or worse still by forces the story never bothers to properly name or identify. Exactly what specific event or slow process ultimately caused their complete, total downfall as an organization is never clarified anywhere within Wild Hunt's own text, leaving one of the entire setting's most genuinely powerful and influential political organizations to simply fade quietly out of recorded history entirely off-screen, its bitter ending glimpsed by players only as a single passing fragment of vague prophecy, rather than a story anyone actually gets to properly witness, unfold in full detail. The Tower, with no known purpose. Aretuza, the prestigious magical academy, where nearly every single major sorceress across the entire wider saga, trained extensively during their formative youth, sits perched dramatically atop Thaned Island, inside a structure that was originally built by elves themselves, long, long before humans ever first arrived on this particular stretch of the continent at all. The imposing tower crowning the academy itself is described at length in supplementary lore as genuinely mysterious in its original intended purpose, strangely hollow and shell-like throughout its overall internal construction. Its true original function lost completely, along with whoever exactly built it, so many centuries ago now. Countless generations of human sorceresses since have simply repurposed a structure whose original intent nobody alive today still remembers, fully understands, or has any real practical way of ever properly recovering or rediscovering through study alone. The island that cannot be left. Adepts formerly admitted into Aretusa for training remain strictly confined there for the entire full duration of their notoriously long and demanding education, with absolutely no visits home permitted whatsoever, and no meaningful outside contact allowed beyond fellow students and permanent staff members, a near total enforced isolation, broken only by rare, tightly controlled formal gatherings known simply as convenes. It's a stark detail the game itself only ever references briefly in passing conversation, yet it quietly recontextualizes nearly every single powerful, self-assured sorceress players eventually meet across the wider story as someone who was, once, as a frightened and often unwilling young child, effectively removed entirely from the wider world and shaped through years of near-total isolation, long before ever properly setting foot back into that same world again as a fully formed adult. It's a detail that recasts the Lodge's later ruthlessness in a somewhat different light. The calculated behavior of women shaped almost entirely by an institution that never once let them simply go home. The meeting that almost wasn't, during the tense, carefully reconvened Lodge's private meeting held at Monte Calvo. Philippa openly and confidently reveals her long-standing intention to formally offer Ciri the Sisterhood's 12th and genuinely final open seat, hoping to eventually marry her off strategically in order to secure lasting, meaningful political influence over the wealthy and powerful kingdom of Kovir and Povis for the Lodge as a whole. The entire ambitious, carefully laid plan is dropped almost as quickly as it's first raised, the moment the wider, far more immediate crisis involving the advancing wild hunt fully takes over the rest of the unfolding story's momentum and urgency, and the game never once properly circles back to address the abandoned scheme again in any real, meaningful detail whatsoever. The rivalry, hidden behind oysters, during a tense, quiet private break taken in the middle of the Lodge's larger formal meeting, Fringilla Vigo, formerly stationed firmly on the opposing side during an earlier bitter war fought between Nilfgaard and the Northern Kingdoms, quietly approaches an isolated Yennefer while she happens to be briefly alone, and drops several genuinely useful hints about potentially escaping the Sisterhood's watchful, controlling influence entirely for good. The two proud women share no obvious warmth toward one another at all, given their complicated, painful shared history, standing on opposite sides of an actual battlefield not so long ago. And yet, Fringilla chooses to help her anyway, for reasons the game itself never fully bothers to explain beyond simple, unspoken pragmatism shared quietly between two remarkably capable women who recognize something useful in each other. The exact underlying nature of whatever private debt, lingering guilt, or personal motive actually prompted her quiet, unexpected assistance in that particular moment remains a genuinely open question, long after that brief scene has ended, and the wider story simply moves on without ever revisiting it. The prince who never got his bride, Philippa's own ambitious, carefully considered plan to marry Ciri off strategically to Tancred Thyssen, the young heir apparent to the wealthy northern kingdom of Kovir, would have fundamentally reshaped the entire political map of the North had it ever actually managed to come to pass as originally intended by the Lodge. The prince himself never once actually appears anywhere in the entire game in person, existing purely as a distant name attached to a larger political scheme that quietly collapses in on itself before it can ever properly begin to unfold or develop any further. What kind of man he actually was in private, and how he might have personally reacted to learning he'd been denied a bride he likely never even knew was being secretly arranged for him behind closed doors by scheming sorceresses, is left entirely to the private imagination of anyone curious enough to wonder about it. The hedgehog who became an emperor, long before he ever came to rule the vast and sprawling Nilfgaardian Empire, a young emir Var Emrace was cruelly and deliberately cursed by a treacherous court mage into a monstrous, half-human, half-hedgehog form in the violent aftermath of a coup that killed his own father outright and stripped him entirely of his rightful birthright in a single terrible night. Wandering, exiled, and visibly disfigured through unfamiliar foreign lands under the borrowed alias Junie, he would eventually cross paths quite by chance with a much younger Geralt himself, years before either man could possibly have understood just how deeply and permanently their separate fates were about to become intertwined forever. How thoroughly this brutal, humiliating early origin genuinely shaped the coldly calculating, entirely merciless ruler he eventually became is a question the game itself only ever raises lightly through quiet implication, rather than through any direct dedicated exploration of his inner life. The curse that broke at midnight, Ymir's own painful curse as Junie lifted only ever briefly each and every single night at the precise stroke of midnight, granting him a few fleeting precious hours spent in his true human form, before the following dawn inevitably dragged the humiliating transformation right back over him, once again without fail or exception. It's never once explained anywhere in the story why the curse itself was specifically structured this particular way, temporary and cyclical, rather than simply being made permanent and total for the rest of his natural life, nor why the vengeful mage responsible chose midnight, specifically as the designated hour of nightly release, rather than any other point during the day or night. The small, curious detail adds a strange, almost old-fashioned fairy tale logic to an otherwise brutally political and coldly calculated story, one the game itself never once bothers to properly justify on any deeper magical or narrative level for curious players. The wife who fell from the ship. Pavetta, Ymir's own beloved wife and Ciri's true biological mother, ultimately dies at sea under circumstances the wider story treats with real, quite deliberate ambiguity throughout, tumbling suddenly overboard during a sudden, violent struggle immediately after discovering her husband's carefully hidden plan to fake both their deaths convincingly and quietly vanish somewhere far away with their young daughter in tow. Whether Ymir genuinely could have saved her life in that desperate moment and simply chose not to for reasons of his own, or whether her tragic death was instead a true painful accident he never actually intended or wanted to happen at all, quietly colors and complicates every single later scene throughout the saga involving his supposed lingering love for his lost, broken family. The story itself never lets players see that pivotal moment clearly enough to judge him with total comfortable certainty either way, no matter how many times it gets referenced or revisited later on. The daughter who was never real. Unable to successfully locate the real Ciri for several long years, despite his sprawling empire's genuinely considerable resources and reach, Ymir eventually accepts a young girl who merely resembles his missing daughter in passing, and knowingly allows her to publicly play the role of Cyrilla of Cintra for the wider court's benefit, fully and completely aware the entire time that she is not, in fact, his real biological child at all. He treats her, by most surviving accounts, with what many readers and players alike tend to interpret as genuine, if deeply complicated and morally uncomfortable, kindness throughout this entire ongoing elaborate deception. What this young girl herself privately understood about her own strange, borrowed situation, and how she truly felt deep down living out an entire public life as someone else's missing presumed daughter, is a story the game itself only ever gestures toward briefly, without ever once letting her speak for herself directly to players. The portraits burned in a single night. Upon finally learning with certainty that his real daughter had genuinely survived after all and was still out there somewhere across the wider continent, Emir immediately orders nearly every single old surviving portrait of Pavetta, of Calanthe, and of his own former humiliating self as Duni destroyed entirely in one single deliberate night of quiet fury, effectively erasing almost all remaining visual evidence of his own complicated, painful past in one swift and decisive stroke. He spares only a single small image from those consuming flames, a modest portrait of Ciri as a peacefully sleeping infant, tucked carefully away somewhere safe rather than burned alongside everything else from his history. Why that one particular image alone managed to survive his otherwise total, ruthless purge of the past is never explained anywhere by the story, though it may well be the single closest moment the entire saga ever comes to showing genuine, unguarded sentiment buried somewhere deep beneath all his cold, practiced calculation. The prophecy, whispered by a traitor. Emir's entire decades-long, deeply obsessive pursuit of Ciri ultimately traces directly back to a single pivotal, quiet conversation held long ago with the ambitious sorcerer Vilgefortz, who first revealed Ithlin's ancient, ominous prophecy to him and successfully convinced the exiled, still cursed Duni that reclaiming his rightful throne and eventually fathering a child together with his own daughter was genuinely the true key to one day ruling the entire continent outright and unopposed. Vilgefortz's own private, carefully hidden motives for sharing such dangerous and world-altering information at all, beyond the many favors, privileges, and growing influence it clearly bought him from a grateful future emperor, are left genuinely murky and unresolved at best throughout the entire wider story. The Emperor's one unlikely mercy. Despite Emir's thoroughly well-earned reputation as a cold, endlessly calculating ruler who tolerates absolutely no perceived threat to his authority from anyone at all, regardless of their station, he consistently and repeatedly treats Geralt with a strange, remarkably steady leniency throughout the entire story that vanishingly few other people ever receive from him under any circumstances. The most immediately obvious explanation ties directly back to Geralt once saving his life as Duni decades earlier during that fateful, chaotic confrontation at Pavetta's own birthday feast, and yet the sheer, unwavering consistency of that particular mercy, extended even in moments when Geralt is quite actively working directly against his own stated interests, suggests something quietly more complicated at play than simple accumulated debt alone. What Emir actually, privately thinks deep down of the Witcher who indirectly shaped his entire family's fate across so many turbulent years is left largely for players themselves to read carefully between the lines of every tense, guarded conversation shared between the two men. The merchant's wager on a goat. Before the local peller can properly perform his important divination ritual, meant to help locate the missing Anna and Tamara, Geralt must first complete an entirely unrelated, almost comedically mundane errand, retrieving the Peller's own wandering pet goat, rather fittingly named Princess, from somewhere out in the surrounding forest where she's wandered off to graze. The quest itself is treated by the game as a small, deliberately light-hearted detour away from the main drama unfolding around it, and yet it's structured as a genuinely mandatory gate that the main story literally cannot proceed past without the player first completing it in full regardless of urgency. The Fisherman's Burning Hands. A local fisherman who once quietly helped both Anna and Tamara flee together from Crow's Perch, under the cover of darkness recalls strange, faintly glowing marks suddenly appearing across Anna's own hands in the tense moments, right before a fiend abruptly emerged without warning from the nearby tree line and carried her off screaming into the dark woods beyond. The strange marks themselves are mentioned only the one single time in brief passing conversation, and never properly explained by the wider story afterward at any point, not by the Peller during his ritual, not by the crones themselves later on, not by anyone else Geralt happens to speak with along the way. Whether the marks were some visible physical side effect of the desperate bargain she'd already secretly struck with the crones beforehand, a protective ward that ultimately failed her at the very worst possible moment, or something else entirely unrelated and unexplained, is left standing as one small, glowing, permanently unexplained detail that nobody in the entire story ever actually stops to properly account for. The War Nobody declared twice. Emhyr personally leads the entire Nilfgaardian Empire into two entirely separate, costly wars against the fractured, quarrelling northern kingdoms across the wider saga, both of them ultimately ending in outright defeat, despite his sprawling empire's genuinely overwhelming size, wealth, and military resources when directly compared to his considerably weaker, divided opponents in the north. The game itself never fully accounts for how a ruler this coldly calculating, this endlessly patient, and this singularly obsessed with total control could realistically manage to lose not once but twice in a row to a fractured, constantly quarrelling north that should, on paper at least, have every conceivable disadvantage stacked heavily against it from the very start of either conflict. Whether his singular, all-consuming personal focus on Ciri and the old prophecy quietly and gradually undermined his own otherwise sound military judgment somewhere along the way over the years is a question the story ultimately leaves for players themselves to weigh entirely on their own, long after the fighting itself has finally, exhaustedly ended